Welcome back to Immortal Glimpse. Tonight we journey into a long, quiet darkness. Not the darkness of dungeons or battles, but the darkness of fields where millions toiled under a system designed to extract every grain, every rupee, every drop of sweat from those who worked the land. This is the story of Indian farmers under British colonial rule, a story of systematic impoverishment, crushing debt, forced cultivation, and famines that killed tens of millions. Settle in. Let the rhythm of this history lull you toward rest. For this is a story told slowly, deliberately, with all the detail that such suffering deserves. The world before the storm. In the decades before British dominance reshaped the Indian subcontinent, agriculture existed as the heartbeat of village life. Picture a village in Bengal in the year 1750, before the East India Company transformed merchant activity into territorial conquest. The morning sun rises over small clusters of mud and thatch homes. Smoke curls from cooking fires where women prepare the morning meal. Children chase each other through narrow lanes between houses. And in the fields beyond the village boundary, farmers begin their day as their fathers and grandfathers had before them. These villages operated as largely self-sufficient communities. The farmer grew what his family needed to survive. Rice paddies stretched across the low-lying lands where monsoon waters collected. Wheat fields covered the northern plains where rainfall was less abundant. Millet and pulses filled the drier regions. When the harvest exceeded the family's immediate needs, the surplus was stored in earthen granaries. These reserves provided protection against the inevitable lean years when the monsoon failed or when pests destroyed portions of the crops. The village functioned as an interconnected organism. Farmers cultivated the land and tended cattle. Weavers created cloth from cotton and silk. Potters shaped vessels from river clay. Washermen cleaned clothes at the riverbank. Carpenters built plows and ox carts. Each person had a role in this complex social and economic network. The land revenue system that existed before British control, while imperfect, acknowledged the realities of agricultural life. Under Mughal rule, which by the mid-18th century had fragmented into regional powers, revenue assessment attempted to match the productive capacity of the soil. The zamindars of this era were not landlords in the European sense but hereditary revenue collectors. The actual farmers retained occupancy rights to their plots as long as they paid revenue. Revenue demands typically ranged from 1/6 to 1/3 of agricultural produce, though this varied by region and ruler. The Tadharmal system, developed under Emperor Akbar, attempted to create scientific assessment based on careful measurement and crop yield estimates. While corruption existed, there remained some understanding that excessive taxation would drive cultivators away. Revenue was often paid in kind, meaning farmers gave a portion of their actual harvest rather than cash. This protected them from market fluctuations. If the harvest failed, the revenue obligation adjusted downward. Local revenue collectors, being part of agricultural society, understood that destroying farmers' productive capacity would ultimately destroy their own income. The village ecosystem maintained balance between extraction and sustainability. Farmers saved seeds from each harvest. They practiced crop rotation, allowing fields to rest. Mixed cropping reduced the risk of total failure. Organic manure from cattle maintained soil health. Water management through traditional tanks and wells supported cultivation even in dry seasons. This was not an agrarian paradise. Famines occurred when monsoons failed. Wars disrupted agriculture. Corrupt officials sometimes demanded excessive revenue. The social system was deeply hierarchical and unequal. Rural life was hard, marked by physical labor from dawn to dusk and vulnerability to natural disasters. Yet the agricultural system possessed internal logic aimed at sustainability. It sought to preserve the productive capacity of both land and farmer across generations. Systems had evolved over centuries through adaptation to local conditions. They incorporated deep knowledge of regional climates, soil types, and crop characteristics. The typical farming family lived simply. Their home consisted of 2 or 3 rooms with mud walls and thatched roof. Cooking occurred over wood or dung fire. Water came from the village well, fetched daily in clay pots. Children helped with farm work from early age. Women managed the household, processed grain, cared for livestock, and assisted in fields during peak seasons. Men handled heavy labor of plowing, sowing, and harvesting. Agricultural calendars revolved around the monsoon. The Kharif season, from June to October, saw cultivation of rice, millet, and cotton. The Rabi season, from October to March, brought wheat, barley, and pulses. Each season had its festivals and rituals, its moments of hope and anxiety as farmers watched the skies. Into this world came the British East India Company and the colonial state it would create. The transformation they brought would reshape every aspect of agricultural life. The new masters and their systems. The British East India Company began as a trading concern, granted a royal charter in 1600 to pursue commerce in the East Indies. But following the Battle of Plassey in 1757 and the Battle of Buxar in 1764, the company transformed from merchant to sovereign. The Mughal emperor granted the company the Diwani, the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa in 1765. This moment marks a watershed in Indian agricultural history. Revenue collection was not merely administrative. In an overwhelmingly agrarian economy, whoever controlled land revenue controlled the economy itself. The company now possessed authority to extract wealth from millions of farmers. The immediate challenge facing company officials was how to maximize revenue while maintaining productive capacity. The company's shareholders in London demanded profits. The administrative machinery required funding. Wars of conquest needed financing. All this wealth would come from the land and those who worked it. The system the company inherited seemed, to British eyes, chaotic and inefficient. Multiple intermediaries stood between cultivator and state. Revenue rights were fragmented and disputed. Assessment methods varied. Records were incomplete by European standards. British officials sought to create order, rationalize administration, and establish permanent, predictable revenue flows. The first experiments proved disastrous. The system adopted in the 1770s involved annual farming of revenue rights. The highest bidder for a district would pay the company a fixed sum, then collect what they could from farmers. This led to ruthless extraction. Revenue farmers, with no long-term interest, squeezed peasants mercilessly. Agricultural production declined. Farmers abandoned lands. And then came catastrophe. The Bengal famine of 1770 killed millions of people. Contemporary estimates suggested approximately 10 million deaths, roughly one-third of Bengal's population, though modern scholars debate these figures, with some suggesting the toll may have been lower, perhaps 1 to 3 million. Regardless of the precise number, the scale of death was catastrophic. While drought contributed to the crisis, the revenue system's rigidity played a crucial role. Company officials continued to demand fixed payments even as crops failed and people starved. No relief was provided. One of history's great famines unfolded while the company exported grain to protect its commercial interests. This catastrophe led to the permanent settlement, also known as the Zamindari system, introduced in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa by Lord Cornwallis in 1793. This represented a bold experiment in social engineering. Cornwallis believed that creating a class of property owners would lead to agricultural improvement. The zamindars would be transformed into landlords with hereditary property rights. In exchange, they would pay the company fixed land revenue in perpetuity. The logic seemed elegant. With permanent ownership, zamindars would have incentive to invest in land improvement. Productivity would rise. The company would receive stable, predictable revenue. The English countryside would be recreated in Bengal. The reality proved different. The revenue demand was set extraordinarily high, fixed at 10/11ths of the rental value of land. This left zamindars with only 1/11th as their share. Furthermore, the assessment was based on inflated estimates of land productivity. Many zamindars found themselves unable to pay. The rules were rigid and unforgiving. Revenue payments were due by sunset on a specific date. Failure to pay in full resulted in immediate sale of the estate at public auction. No allowances were made for poor harvests, floods, or droughts. Between 1793 and 1815, hundreds of zamindari estates were sold for revenue default. Old landed families were dispossessed. New purchasers were often urban merchants, company officials, and moneylenders who saw zamindaris as investments. These absentee landlords had no personal connection to the land or the people who worked it. The actual cultivators, the ryots who worked the land, found their situation deteriorating. The new zamindars, pressed to meet revenue demands and recoup investments, raised rents relentlessly. Ryots who had occupied lands for generations suddenly faced eviction if they could not pay. Security of tenure evaporated. Customary protections were ignored. Zamindars employed agents and enforcers to collect rent. These intermediaries operated with limited oversight. They demanded illegal fees on top of official rent. They manipulated accounts to show peasants perpetually in arrears. Physical coercion became standard. The peasant who protested faced harassment or violence. Moreover, zamindari estates became subdivided into layers of intermediaries. A zamindar might lease collection rights to a sub-zamindar, who might further sublease. Each layer extracted its share. By the time demands reached the actual cultivator, the total burden might be several times the original assessment. The permanent settlement covered roughly 19% of British India. In these regions, the transformation was profound. Villages became revenue-generating units in an extractive apparatus. Traditional bonds were severed. In their place came purely economic relationships based on contract, rent, and threat of eviction. Company officials, observing the dysfunction, sought alternative approaches. The riotory system, developed by Thomas Munro and implemented primarily in Madras and Bombay presidencies, represented a different philosophy. Under this system, the company settled revenue directly with individual cultivators, eliminating intermediaries. Each registered landholder became recognized as proprietor, responsible for paying land revenue. Cultivators gained rights to sell, mortgage, or lease their land. On paper, the riotory system appeared more favorable. Without zamindari intermediaries, farmers would face lower revenue demands and gain security. Munro argued this would create a class of small peasant proprietors, a conservative property-owning class loyal to British rule. The reality diverged from theory. Revenue assessments reached 50 to 60% of gross produce. In irrigated lands, the assessment could reach 60%. These rates far exceeded what cultivators had typically paid under previous systems. They were fixed in cash, forcing farmers into the money economy regardless of harvest results. The assessment process gave enormous power to lower-level revenue officials. Surveyors measured land and estimated productive capacity. Accountants recorded holdings and dues. These officials, poorly paid and often corrupt, manipulated the system for personal gain. Underassessment in exchange for bribes became common. So did overassessment of lands belonging to farmers who would not pay bribes. The requirement to pay revenue in cash, at fixed times regardless of harvest conditions, created immediate problems. If the crop failed, the ryot still owed full assessment. If market prices dropped, he still needed cash. If he fell ill during harvest and could not bring in his crop, his obligation remained unchanged. The system possessed no flexibility. Ryots who could not pay faced immediate consequences. Their land could be sold at auction. Their property could be seized. The threat of dispossession hung over every family. In practice, this meant farmers turned to moneylenders to bridge the gap between their resources and the revenue demand. The third major system, the Mahilwari system, represented an attempt to compromise. Introduced in the Gangetic Valley, parts of the northwestern provinces, central India, and Punjab, this system treated entire villages as the unit of revenue assessment. The village headman or representative body became responsible for paying revenue on behalf of all cultivators. The assessment was subject to periodic revision, typically every 20 or 30 years. The state's share was initially set around 66% of rental value, later reduced to 50% in some areas. The Mahawari system aimed to preserve something of traditional village community structure while ensuring revenue collection. Village residents would collectively decide how to apportion the burden. Those with more productive lands would pay more. The community as a whole bore responsibility. In practice, the system suffered from the same fundamental flaw: the revenue demand was too high. Village headmen and dominant families used their positions to shift tax burdens onto weaker members. The poor and marginalized paid disproportionate shares while the powerful protected their interests. Periodic reassessments created anxiety and opportunity for corruption. Every reassessment required new surveys and calculations. Officials used these occasions to extract bribes. Disputes over land boundaries festered. Villages descended into internal conflicts over how revenue obligations should be distributed. Across all three systems, certain features remained constant. Revenue demands were inflexible. Cash payments were mandatory. Default resulted in land sale and dispossession. The bureaucratic apparatus operated with little accountability. And the fundamental purpose of the system, extracting maximum revenue for the colonial state, overrode all other considerations including the welfare of cultivators or the long-term health of agriculture. British officials justified these harsh systems through various rationales. They argued that Indian cultivators were lazy and would not work harder without economic pressure. They claimed that English-style private property in land would unleash productive energies. They insisted that rational administration required fixed, predictable revenues. They believed these policies would ultimately benefit Indian agriculture through the magic of market incentives and secure property rights. What they created instead was a massive apparatus of extraction that systematically impoverished the farming population, disrupted traditional agricultural practices, and subordinated Indian agriculture to the needs of British industry and imperial finance. The crushing weight of debt. The transformation of Indian agriculture cannot be understood without examining the twin pressures of taxation and debt. These were not separate problems but interconnected aspects of a single system that reduced agricultural producers to perpetual indebtedness. The land revenue assessment represented a claim on agricultural production that far exceeded what farmers could sustainably pay while maintaining their families and their land's productivity. In Rayatwari areas, revenue typically consumed 50 to 60% of gross produce. In Zamindari estates, while the government's demand was fixed, actual rent extracted from cultivators often reached similar or higher proportions. In Mahawari territories, the collective burden fell on villages with similar intensity. These revenue demands shared a critical characteristic: they were fixed in monetary terms and payable in cash. This represented a fundamental departure from pre-colonial systems where revenue had often been paid in kind, as a portion of actual harvest. The requirement for cash payment forced farmers into market participation whether they wished to or not. They had to sell their produce to obtain money for revenue payment, even if prices were unfavorable, even if they would have preferred to store grain for their own consumption. The timing of revenue payments created additional pressure. Revenue was due at fixed dates, typically shortly after harvest. This meant farmers had to sell produce immediately, during the period when supply was highest and prices lowest. They could not wait for better prices. They sold because the revenue deadline loomed. Merchants and grain dealers understood this dynamic perfectly and used it to their advantage, purchasing grain from desperate farmers at rock-bottom prices. The penalties for failing to pay revenue on time were immediate and severe. In Rayatwari areas, the farmer's land could be auctioned after a single season of default. In Zamindari territories, landlords could evict tenants who failed to pay rent. The legal system provided no real protection for cultivators. Courts operated in English or formal legal language incomprehensible to illiterate farmers. Land auctions became regular occurrences across rural India. When a farmer defaulted on revenue, his holding was sold to the highest bidder. Often the purchasers were moneylenders, merchants, or wealthy peasants who accumulated land at these distress sales. The dispossessed farmer might become a tenant on land his family had once owned, or join the growing population of landless agricultural laborers. Faced with revenue demands they could not meet from current harvest, farmers turned to moneylenders. The village sahukar, mahajan, or bania operated as the primary source of rural credit. These moneylenders were often members of specific commercial castes, families that had engaged in money lending for generations. The interest rates charged by village moneylenders ranged from 24 to 36% annually for secured loans, and could reach 75 to 100% for unsecured advances. These rates far exceeded anything considered reasonable by modern standards, but farmers had no alternatives. The British administration did not establish agricultural credit institutions. Banks served urban commercial interests and would not lend to small farmers. The only option was the village moneylender on whatever terms he offered. The loan process was simple but exploitative. The farmer needed money to pay revenue, to purchase seed, to cover a marriage expense, or to survive food shortage. He approached the moneylender and requested an advance. The moneylender would assess the farmer's assets, primarily his land, and decide whether to extend credit. If the loan was granted, it was typically secured by mortgage on the land or by promise to deliver future harvests at predetermined prices. The accounting was entirely in the moneylender's hands. Most farmers were illiterate and could not maintain their own records or verify calculations. The initial loan amount would be recorded, along with interest rate. But the moneylender might also deduct various fees up front, so the farmer received less than the nominal loan amount. Interest compounded, often annually or more frequently. When harvest came, the farmer would deliver grain to the moneylender, who would value it according to his own assessment and credit it against the debt. These valuations favored the lender. Over time, the debt grew. The farmer borrowed more to pay interest on previous loans. He borrowed to pay revenue that his harvest could not cover. He borrowed to meet family emergencies. Each new loan added to the total burden. The compounding interest meant debt increased faster than the farmer could possibly repay it through agricultural income. Many farmers descended into what contemporaries called hereditary debt. The son inherited not just his father's land but his father's debts. These debts, accumulated over decades, could exceed the value of the land many times over. The family worked not for their own benefit but to generate income that went directly to the moneylender. They were debt serfs, tied to the land by obligations they could never discharge. When debt became completely unsustainable, land changed hands. The moneylender would initiate foreclosure proceedings or the farmer would voluntarily surrender land in settlement. In some cases, transfers were recorded as sales at nominal prices far below market value. In other cases, the farmer retained nominal ownership while the moneylender took possession and income, with the farmer working as a laborer on his own property. The British legal system, introduced to replace traditional dispute resolution, actually facilitated this transfer of land from cultivators to moneylenders. Courts enforced contracts without examining whether terms were unconscionable. They recognized mortgage rights and debt obligations without considering the borrower's capacity to repay. They provided legal mechanisms for foreclosure and property seizure that worked efficiently from the creditor's perspective but offered no protection to debtors. The social position of moneylenders within villages became increasingly dominant. They were not merely creditors but controllers of agricultural production. Through advances against future harvests, they directed what crops farmers would grow. They influenced agricultural decisions, pushing farmers toward crops that served the moneylender's commercial interests rather than the farmer's subsistence needs. In many regions, moneylenders also became landlords as they accumulated land through foreclosures. This concentration of economic power created a rural elite whose interests aligned with British rule. Moneylenders benefited from the colonial legal system that enforced their contracts and protected their property. They had no interest in changing an agricultural system that generated a constant flow of indebted farmers whose land they could acquire. The British administration occasionally expressed concern about rural indebtedness. Various commissions investigated the problem and produced reports describing the magnitude of debt and its effects. But proposed solutions were timid and ineffective. Debt limitation laws that attempted to cap interest rates or regulate lending practices were poorly enforced or easily evaded. The fundamental problem was never addressed: the revenue demand was too high. As long as farmers had to pay 50 to 60% of their produce as revenue or rent, they would inevitably fall into debt during lean years. And once in debt, the combination of high interest rates and continued heavy taxation made escape virtually impossible. The psychological impact of perpetual debt should not be underestimated. Farmers lived with constant anxiety about meeting the next payment, about losing their land, about leaving nothing but debt to their children. Some farmers, facing insurmountable debt and the prospect of losing everything, chose suicide. These tragedies were direct consequences of an agricultural system that valued revenue extraction over human welfare. The forced march toward cash crops. The transformation of Indian agriculture involved not just changes in land tenure and revenue collection but a fundamental reorientation of what farmers grew. Traditional Indian agriculture had been primarily subsistence-oriented. Farmers grew food crops to feed their families, with surplus sold for other necessities. The British system increasingly forced farmers away from food production toward cultivation of non-food cash crops demanded by British industry and global markets. This transformation served the broader logic of colonial economics. Britain's Industrial Revolution created enormous demand for raw materials that could not be produced in Britain's climate. Cotton for textile mills in Manchester and Lancashire. Indigo for dyeing cloth. Jute for making sacks and rope. Opium for export to China. Tea and coffee for British consumers. These crops could be grown in India, and British policy deliberately encouraged or compelled their cultivation. The mechanisms of this transformation were multiple. Revenue demands payable in cash forced farmers to grow crops that could be sold rather than consumed. Moneylenders who advanced credit specified what crops farmers must grow, directing them toward commercial crops. British and European plantation companies acquired land and directly cultivated export crops. Government policies provided infrastructure and support for cash crop production while neglecting food crop agriculture. Indigo cultivation provides perhaps the clearest example of how farmers were forced into cash crop production against their interests. Indigo, a plant whose leaves yield a deep blue dye, had been cultivated in India for centuries. But under British rule, indigo production became systematized and coercive on a scale previously unknown. European indigo planters, primarily British, established themselves in Bengal and Bihar from the late 18th century onward. They obtained land from zamindars or directly from the colonial government. They developed what became known as the Tincathia system to secure indigo production. Under the Tincathia system, planters contracted with farmers to grow indigo on a specified portion of their land, typically 3 kathas out of every 20 kathas. The planter would advance money to the farmer for seeds and cultivation expenses. In return, the farmer was obligated to grow indigo on the designated land and sell the entire harvest to the planter at a price the planter determined. This system was coercive from its inception. Contract terms were dictated by planters who held all the economic and legal power. Advances given to farmers were calculated to create dependency rather than provide fair compensation. Prices paid for indigo were kept artificially low, often below the cost of cultivation. Farmers who accepted Tincathia contracts found themselves trapped in a cycle similar to debt bondage. Moreover, indigo cultivation was destructive to soil fertility. The plant exhausted the land, making it less productive for food crops in subsequent seasons. Farmers forced to grow indigo on their best land found their capacity to grow rice or other food crops diminished. The 3/20th specified in the contract often expanded in practice, with planters demanding more land be devoted to indigo. The planters employed enforcement mechanisms that went beyond contract law. They hired lethiels, armed enforcers who intimidated and assaulted farmers who tried to resist growing indigo or who demanded fair prices. They manipulated the legal system, bringing charges against farmers for breach of contract. They colluded with local revenue officials and police to ensure compliance. Farmers hated indigo cultivation. It reduced their food security, damaged their land, and brought them into contact with violent and abusive planters. Yet they were trapped. The initial advance created debt. Refusing to grow indigo meant facing legal action and physical violence. Many farmers endured this exploitation for decades. Cotton production underwent similar transformation. Cotton had long been grown in India, supporting a thriving domestic textile industry. But as British textile mills demanded raw cotton, cultivation expanded dramatically, particularly in the Deccan, Gujarat and Punjab regions. The American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 created a cotton boom in India. With American cotton supplies disrupted, British mills turned to India. Cotton prices soared. Farmers in cotton-growing regions expanded cotton acreage dramatically, often replacing food crops. Moneylenders advanced credit specifically for cotton cultivation. But when the Civil War ended and American cotton returned to world markets, prices collapsed. Indian farmers who had gone into debt to expand cotton production found themselves unable to repay loans. Land alienation accelerated. Farmers could not easily return to food crop production because they lacked seeds, their land had been adapted to cotton, and they still needed to grow cash crops to pay debts. The cotton boom and bust demonstrated the vulnerability of farmers forced into commercial production for global markets. They had no control over prices, which fluctuated based on conditions halfway around the world. They bore all the risk while merchants and moneylenders captured most of the profit. Jute cultivation in Bengal followed a similar trajectory. Jute, used primarily for making burlap sacks, became an important export crop as global trade expanded. British companies established jute mills in Calcutta to process raw jute. Farmers in Bengal increasingly devoted land to jute cultivation, at the expense of rice and other food crops. Opium represents perhaps the most morally problematic cash crop forced on Indian farmers. The British East India Company held a monopoly on opium production in Bengal and Bihar. The company needed opium to export to China, where it was sold illegally, generating enormous profits that helped balance Britain's trade deficit with China. Indian farmers were compelled to grow opium poppies under a system of advance contracts similar to the indigo system. The opium department contracted with farmers, advanced money for cultivation, and purchased the raw opium at fixed prices. Farmers had to deliver specified quantities of acceptable quality or face penalties. Prices paid were kept low to maximize government profits. Poppy cultivation was labor-intensive and required land that could otherwise grow food. Each poppy bulb had to be individually scored to collect the latex that contained opium. Farmers devoted significant time and land to producing a product that served no purpose for their own communities but fed a drug trade that British authorities knew was destructive. Tea and coffee plantations introduced yet another dimension. European companies acquired vast tracts in Assam, Darjeeling, the Nilgiri Hills, and other regions. These plantations employed a different labor system. Companies recruited workers using advance payments that created debt bondage. Workers were transported to plantations, housed in company-controlled lines, paid minimal wages, and kept in dependency through debt and isolation. Conditions on plantations were harsh. Workers labored long hours in all weather. Housing was cramped. Medical care was minimal. Wages barely sufficed for survival. Workers who tried to leave were pursued and forced to return, with colonial laws supporting plantation owners' claims on indebted labor. The shift toward cash crop cultivation had profound consequences for food security. When farmers devoted more land to cotton, indigo, jute, or opium, they grew less rice, wheat, millet, and pulses. This made them vulnerable to food shortages. When the cash crop harvest failed or prices collapsed, they could not simply eat cotton or indigo. They had to purchase food, often at inflated prices, driving them further into debt. Commercialization also changed farming practices. Cash crops often required monoculture, planting a single crop across large areas rather than the mixed cropping that traditional agriculture employed. Monoculture increased vulnerability to pests and diseases. It degraded soil more rapidly. It provided no safety net when the single crop failed. Investment in agriculture flowed toward cash crop infrastructure rather than food production. Irrigation works, when built, served cotton or jute regions. Railways were designed to transport cash crops to ports for export, not to distribute food grains to deficit areas. Government agricultural research focused on improving cash crop yields, not on enhancing food security. By the early 20th century, Indian agriculture had been fundamentally reoriented. Vast acreages that once grew food now produced cotton, jute, tea, and other export commodities. The subcontinent that had historically fed itself now imported food grains even while exporting agricultural products. Farmers who grew the cash crops often could not afford to purchase adequate food for their own families. The history of Indian agriculture under British rule is marked by devastating famines that killed tens of millions of people. These famines were not simply natural disasters resulting from droughts or floods. They were human-made catastrophes, the predictable consequences of colonial agricultural and economic policies that valued revenue extraction and commercial profit over human survival. Pre-colonial India certainly experienced food shortages when monsoons failed or other natural disasters struck. But traditional systems provided some mitigation. Grain storage at household and community levels offered buffers against short-term shortages. Rulers understood that their legitimacy depended partly on providing famine relief. Agricultural practices maintained diversity that reduced complete crop failure. Under British rule, these traditional safety nets were systematically dismantled while new vulnerabilities were created. The commercialization of agriculture reduced food grain production. Peasant grain reserves disappeared as farmers had to sell immediately after harvest to pay revenue. Traditional welfare obligations of rulers were replaced by laissez-faire economic doctrines that opposed state intervention in markets. The statistics are staggering. Estimates suggest that between 12 and 30 million Indians died in famines during the late 19th century alone. The Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 killed millions across southern and central India. The famines of the 1890s claimed millions more. And the Bengal famine of 1943 killed approximately 3 million people in a single region. Let us examine the Bengal famine of 1770, one of the earliest major famines under company rule. Rainfall was deficient in 1768 and 1769, leading to reduced harvests. By 1770, food scarcity had become severe. But rather than providing relief or reducing revenue demands, company officials actually increased revenue collection from Bengal by 10% in 1770, even as people were dying of starvation. The logic held that maintaining revenue was essential to company finances. Reducing revenue demands would harm company profits. The prevailing economic thought emphasized that markets would naturally correct food scarcity through price signals. Interfering with markets would only make things worse. Private charity, not state action, should address any hardship. The result was catastrophic. People ate leaves, bark, and anything remotely digestible. They sold their tools, their cattle, their land, trying to buy food. Bodies lined the roads. Villages were depopulated. Contemporary accounts described scenes of almost unimaginable horror. Even as millions starved, company officials maintained exports of grain from Bengal. Ships loaded with rice left Calcutta bound for other markets while Bengalis died. The company's commercial interests came before human survival. When the famine finally ended, approximately one-third of Bengal's population had perished, though modern scholars debate the exact figure, with estimates ranging from 1 to 10 million deaths. The Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 demonstrated that colonial authorities had learned little. This famine affected the Deccan, Mysore, Madras, Bombay, and parts of central India and Rajasthan. The death toll was staggering, with estimates ranging from 5.6 to over 10 million fatalities, with careful modern demographic studies suggesting approximately 8.2 million deaths. Rainfall failed in 1876, leading to crop failures. By 1877, conditions were desperate across vast regions. British officials, led by Lord Lytton, responded with policies based on strict laissez-faire principles. They refused to interfere with grain markets, even as merchants hoarded supplies and prices soared beyond what ordinary people could pay. They opposed large-scale relief efforts, arguing that providing free food would demoralize recipients. They insisted that any relief must be provided only through labor on public works projects, and that relief wages must be set below market wages. The public works relief camps became death camps. People too weak from starvation could not perform required labor. Relief wages could not purchase enough food at famine prices. Sanitation in camps was non-existent, leading to disease outbreaks. Cholera and dysentery killed thousands. Meanwhile, grain continued to be exported from India. In 1877, at the height of the famine, British India exported substantial quantities of wheat and rice. Railways were used to move grain to ports for export rather than to transport grain to deficit areas. Lytton's administration also organized the Delhi Durbar in 1877, a spectacular imperial celebration marking Queen Victoria's proclamation as Empress of India. The Durbar cost enormous sums and consumed resources that could have provided famine relief. As millions starved, the British Raj staged pageantry celebrating its own power. The Bengal famine of 1943 occurred under different circumstances but revealed the same fundamental disregard for Indian lives. Bengal experienced disruptions from multiple causes. A cyclone in October 1942 damaged crops in some areas, the Japanese occupation of Burma in early 1942 cut off rice imports that Bengal had become dependent on, wartime inflation raised prices dramatically, and British military policies diverted resources to the war effort. The death toll reached approximately 3 million people, though estimates have ranged from 2.1 to 3 million deaths from starvation and disease. The famine was not primarily caused by crop failure. Recent research analyzing soil moisture data has shown that the 1943 Bengal famine was unique among Indian famines in not being directly linked to drought. Rainfall in 1943 was actually above average in many areas. The Bengal rice harvest, while below the record yields of some previous years, was not catastrophically lower than in years when no famine occurred. Based on this evidence, historians have concluded that the famine resulted primarily from policy failures and wartime economic disruptions rather than agricultural shortfalls. Several factors combined to create artificial scarcity. Grain merchants and wealthier individuals hoarded supplies, anticipating rising prices. This speculation removed food from markets when it was most needed. The British colonial government requisitioned rice and other supplies for the military. The war administration also seized boats and vehicles used for transporting grain, disrupting distribution networks. Provincial trade barriers prevented grain from moving freely across India. Bengal, which had become dependent on rice imports from Burma, could not easily access surplus grain from Punjab or other regions. The priorities of the war administration focused on feeding troops and maintaining stockpiles for military operations. The role of British wartime leadership in the famine remains debated among historians. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his war cabinet have been criticized for failing to provide adequate relief or to divert shipping to bring grain to Bengal. Some historians argue that Churchill's government prioritized war efforts and European populations over Indian civilians. A 2019 study published in Geophysical Research Letters concluded that British wartime policy significantly contributed to the famine's severity. Other scholars contend that shipping constraints and military priorities during wartime complicated relief efforts, though this does not fully explain the inadequate response. People ate what they could find, including grass and tree bark. Families sold everything they owned to buy food at inflated prices. Children were abandoned. Women were forced into prostitution to survive. Bodies littered roadsides and city streets. Photographs from this period show skeletal figures. The famines under British rule represent one of the great crimes of colonialism. British policy deliberately subordinated Indian food security to imperial economic needs. The consequences included some of history's worst famines, killing tens of millions even as India exported food to Britain and other countries. Indian farmers did not accept their exploitation passively. Throughout the colonial period, peasant movements and uprisings challenged the system that oppressed them. These movements, while often localized and ultimately suppressed, demonstrated the agency and resilience of farmers who refused to accept their impoverishment as inevitable. The Indigo Revolt of 1859 to 1860 represents one of the most significant peasant movements of the 19th century. In Bengal, farmers who had endured decades of coercive indigo cultivation finally organized mass resistance. The movement began in the district of Nadia and spread rapidly across indigo-growing regions. Farmers refused to plant indigo. They refused to accept advances from planters. They socially boycotted those who continued to cooperate with the planter system. The revolt was remarkable for its organization and discipline. Village headmen and local leaders coordinated resistance across multiple districts. Farmers held meetings and took collective oaths not to cultivate indigo. When planters attempted to enforce contracts through their lethiels, farmers resisted, sometimes violently. The planters, accustomed to cowing individual farmers, found themselves facing organized communities. The Bengali press and intelligentsia supported the movement. The play Nil Durpan, by Dinabandhu Mitra, published in 1858, dramatized the sufferings of indigo cultivators and exposed the brutality of planters. The play created a sensation and brought the issue to public attention. Missionaries and reformers documented the abuses of the indigo system and pressured authorities to investigate. The British government eventually appointed an indigo commission to investigate. The commission's report, published in 1860, acknowledged many of the farmers' grievances and recommended that indigo cultivation be made voluntary rather than compulsory. While planters attempted to continue the system, the resistance had broken their power. Indigo cultivation in Bengal declined sharply after 1860, though it continued in Bihar under modified forms. The Indigo Revolt demonstrated that organized peasant resistance could achieve results. It showed that farmers, despite their poverty and illiteracy, could mobilize effectively when pushed beyond endurance. The movement inspired later peasant struggles and contributed to the development of nationalist consciousness. The Deccan riots of 1875 erupted in the Pune and Ahmednagar districts of Maharashtra. These riots targeted moneylenders rather than British authorities directly, but they reflected the same underlying problem of crushing debt created by the colonial agricultural system. Farmers, driven to desperation by debts they could never repay, attacked moneylenders' houses and destroyed debt records. The violence was targeted and purposeful. Rioters sought out account books and burned them, symbolically erasing the debts that enslaved them. They generally avoided harming people, though property destruction was extensive. The movement spread across several districts before being suppressed by police and military forces. The British government responded by appointing a commission to investigate agricultural indebtedness in the Deccan. The resulting Deccan Agriculturists' Relief Act of 1879 attempted to provide some protection to cultivators against money-lending practices, though its effectiveness was limited. More significantly, the riots demonstrated the intensity of rural anger and the potential for mass unrest. The Champaran Satyagraha of 1917 marked Mahatma Gandhi's entry into the Indian nationalist movement and represented a new approach to peasant resistance. In the Champaran district of Bihar, indigo planters had continued to extract forced cultivation from farmers through the Tinkathia system long after it had been abandoned in Bengal. Farmers, organized by local leaders like Raj Kumar Shukla, invited Gandhi to investigate their grievances. Gandhi arrived in Champaran in 1917 and conducted a detailed survey of conditions, documenting the exploitation farmers faced. His presence brought national attention to the issue. When authorities ordered him to leave the district, he refused and courted arrest. His willingness to face legal consequences for supporting farmers created a sensation. The British government, concerned about the political implications, appointed a commission to investigate. Gandhi served on this commission, and the resulting reforms ended the Tinkathia system in Bihar. Farmers were released from compulsory indigo cultivation. While the reforms were limited, the Champaran Satyagraha demonstrated the power of organized nonviolent resistance and established Gandhi as a leader of the nationalist movement. The Bardoli Satyagraha of 1928, also led by Gandhi's associate Vallabhbhai Patel, challenged excessive land revenue assessment in Gujarat. When the government raised revenue demands by 30% despite poor harvest conditions, farmers of Bardoli district refused to pay. The movement maintained discipline despite government attempts at coercion. Eventually, the government appointed an inquiry committee and reduced the revenue enhancement. The successful resistance earned Patel the title Sardar and demonstrated the effectiveness of organized nonviolent non-cooperation. These movements and many others like them across India shared common features. They arose from concrete grievances about taxation, debt, and forced cultivation. They achieved their greatest success when they mobilized entire communities rather than isolated individuals. They often received support from urban intellectuals and the nationalist movement. And they demonstrated that British rule depended ultimately on the acquiescence of those it governed. The legacy of colonial agricultural policy extended far beyond the end of British rule in 1947. Independent India inherited an agricultural system that had been systematically impoverished over nearly 2 centuries. Agricultural productivity was stagnant. Rural poverty was endemic. Landlessness had increased dramatically. Infrastructure was inadequate. And the social fabric of rural communities had been severely damaged. The new government faced enormous challenges. Land reforms attempted to address the most egregious inequalities, abolishing zamindari estates and placing limits on landholdings. Agricultural development programs sought to increase productivity through improved seeds, fertilizers, and irrigation. The Green Revolution of the 1960s and 1970s dramatically increased wheat and rice production, though it also created new dependencies and environmental problems. Yet many of the structural problems created during colonial rule persisted. Small and marginal farmers continued to struggle with debt. Moneylenders, though no longer the dominant force they once were, remained important sources of rural credit. Agricultural incomes lagged behind urban incomes, driving migration from villages to cities. Periodic droughts and crop failures still pushed farmers into crisis, and farmer suicides, tragically, continued to occur when debt became unsustainable. The ecological damage caused by colonial agricultural policies also had long-term consequences. Deforestation to create plantations and expand cultivation continued after independence. Soil degradation from intensive cultivation and inadequate fallowing reduced productivity. Traditional water management systems, neglected under colonial rule, required restoration. The diversity of crops and agricultural practices that had characterized pre-colonial agriculture gave way to monocultures focused on a few commercially important crops. Understanding this history helps explain many aspects of contemporary Indian agriculture and rural society. The patterns of landholding, the relationship between farmers and markets, the role of credit and debt, the vulnerability to climate variation, all these have roots in colonial period transformations. The challenges faced by Indian farmers today are not new but represent the continuation of problems created or exacerbated by colonial rule. The story of Indian farmers under British rule is ultimately a story about power and extraction. It demonstrates how colonial capitalism transformed agriculture from a way of life aimed at subsistence and sustainability into a mechanism for extracting wealth from those who worked the land. It shows how laws, institutions, and economic policies can systematically transfer resources from the poor to the wealthy, from the colonized to the colonizers. But it is also a story of resilience and resistance. Indian farmers, despite facing overwhelming odds, maintained their dignity. They supported their families. They preserved agricultural knowledge. They organized movements for justice. They survived, and they ensured that their descendants would inherit not just the problems created by colonialism but also the strength to address them. Conclusion. We have traveled through nearly 2 centuries of history, from the self-sufficient villages of pre-colonial India to the debt-ridden, famine-stricken countryside of the late colonial period. We have seen how the British East India Company and the colonial state transformed Indian agriculture through 3 different revenue systems that shared a common goal: extracting maximum wealth from those who worked the land. We have witnessed the crushing weight of taxation that consumed 50 to 60% of agricultural production. We have followed farmers into the trap of debt, where interest rates of 24 to 36% per year made escape impossible and created hereditary bondage passed from father to son. We have watched as farmers were forced away from growing food for their families toward cultivating cash crops for distant markets and British industries. We have confronted the horror of famines that killed tens of millions of people while grain was exported from India to Britain. The Bengal famine of 1770 that killed millions. The Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 that killed an estimated 8.2 million. The Bengal famine of 1943 that killed approximately 3 million even in the 20th century. These were not acts of nature but consequences of policies that valued revenue and commercial profit over human life. And we have seen resistance. The Indigo Revolt that broke the power of indigo planters in Bengal. The Deccan riots that targeted the moneylenders who held farmers in debt bondage. The Champaran Satyagraha that ended forced cultivation in Bihar and launched Gandhi's movement. The Bardoli Satyagraha that forced reduction of excessive revenue demands. These movements remind us that even in the darkest times, people resist oppression and fight for justice. The transformation of Indian agriculture under British rule represents one of the great crimes of colonialism. A system that had sustained hundreds of millions of people for centuries was deliberately restructured to serve imperial interests. The result was mass impoverishment, recurring famines, social disruption, and ecological damage that persisted long after independence. This history matters because its effects continue to shape contemporary India. The challenges faced by Indian farmers today, debt, inadequate prices for crops, vulnerability to drought, land fragmentation, have roots in colonial policies. Understanding this history helps us understand present conditions and the work still needed to create truly just and sustainable agriculture. As you drift toward sleep, remember the millions who toiled in those fields under impossible burdens. Remember the families torn apart by debt and famine. Remember the resistance movements that refused to accept exploitation as inevitable. Their story, however dark, is part of human history and deserves to be remembered. If you found this exploration of history meaningful, please like this video and subscribe to Immortal Glimpse for more deep dives into the past. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What aspects of this history surprised you? How do you see its effects in the present day? Thank you for watching. Sleep well, and remember that understanding the past helps us build a better future.